Phenomenal. So first, thank you so much for having us. I'm here with one of my research partners, Davide Rental, who is looking at this notion about innovation and sustainability, but from a coaching standpoint. As the very generous introduction mentioned, I tend to look at systems and organizations, and he's very focused on how this impacts leaders and how they can work with their own emotions and the emotions of others. We wanted to run some of the research that we've been doing around the impact of climate change on human emotions. So we've heard a couple of speakers around stranded assets, also the opportunity towards traceability. And so we often think about climate in its material incarnation, but we wanted to share with you some of our thoughts around how do we think about climate change, not just the nefarious impact on sort of how we feel about the world, how we present at work, how our children are feeling, but also as an opportunity for innovation, not just on the material side, but also on the human side. You'll notice through our presentation that we've embedded QR codes. These are 2 codes to our LinkedIn profile. We were very happy to connect with anyone. And then as we go through, we also have QR codes that link to some of our published works. Unless I hear anything to the contrary, I'm going to assume that the screen is working and that you are hearing me clearly. The first contention that we would like to discuss is this notion of climate distress. So it's a topic that has been now covered by the American Psychological Association, and it is it's a whole set of emotions that we might be feeling about the climate. What's interesting about the climate as an issue to focus on as emotional research is that it can also be very much of a proxy for other things. So it is the social issues that we have been sort of grappling with in many countries around the world. And the way that we react to these emotions is also a proxy for the way that we tend to think about other things. As leaders, there are a couple of options that we tend to have. One is to say these issues do not belong at work. And the other is to say not only do they belong at work directly, which we will talk about in a couple of upcoming slides, but they also belong at work because the emotions surrounding these issues are coming to work and you cannot really ignore them. So a little bit of a definition at first and what it is that we think about. I happen to have been in the fires that decimated parts of Los Angeles over the winter. And then we also have family in Florida. And some of the anxiety that we feel around climate distress is a local one, which is whatever involves us today, but also because of our phones, we're much more connected to tragedies all over the world. So if there is a mudslide or catastrophic flooding in different parts of the world, I'm impacted by it if I have people whom I care about in this particular region. So there's a constant connection to the impact of climate on how it's operating on us. Then we can think about the different emotions that we might have around this topic. Some of it could be grief, which is the world is really changing. It's especially prominent among young people who are now in the workforce. They're scared, they're worried, and not only that, they're angry because they're looking at people from our generation saying, how could you let it get this way? And then often a follow-on emotion is one of powerlessness. And powerlessness can be, well, it's too late, it's of no use. And that's really heartbreaking because that isn't a place where people can sort of affect change, but really affects the way that they present. So one of the articles that may be worth considering is The Lancet did a big article around and big research around how this affects different generations. It's not just young people, it's many other generations, but also because we're managing young people and they live in our hearts and our communities, they are very, very preoccupied. There's a great deal of emerging research in the US around how this actually presents. So there are many ways that this will present directly in our workplaces. And by workplaces, I mean universities, factory floors, but also our academic institutions. If there is something happening outside or if there is a heat wave, it's very difficult for students to concentrate. There are 3 main presentations here that are physical but impact the cognitive and emotional well-being. So one is heat. So we know from research that, there's heat exhaustion, direct exhaustion, but also more death by suicide when it's very hot, more domestic violence, more visit to the ER, more psychiatric admissions. There are also some psych medicines that actually make it very hard for us to regulate our temperature. Then there is air pollution. There is much research emerging around the fact that air pollution is negatively impacting our ability, our cognition. It's also related maybe to higher rates of dementia and mood disorders. It's a lot harder to regulate if you're not breathing well. And the third order effect, which is a little bit further down, is that climate change is actually changing the composition of our food, and that deficiency in iron and zinc actually lead to greater fatigue, concentration issues, mood issues that, as we know, are also part and parcel of mental health challenges. So when things like that happen to us, and we want you to sort of think about, a team meeting or a dinner table conversation, there can be a couple of responses. So often you might have a highly anxious person in your team or in your research group or in your family, which is, well, we are not safe. The world is coming to an end. Should we really be at the office? And then you might have another type of reaction, which could present as contempt, which is, we're at work in order to work. I am not at work in order to save the world. There's really very little that we can do here, but what we really need to do is get the work done. Both of these often, and we see it also with conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, or even political polarization, we often think of those as polar extremes, which is, one person may be overly anxious and the other person is overly dismissive. What we would like to consider is the fact that both of these emotions actually have a common parent, which is fear. And often the fear could be of losing control. So think about how this might present as anxiety. I cannot be safe here because I cannot breathe the air. I will not make it to the end of this meeting. We will not conclude our project, and I will not be able to go home to my children. Both of these individuals are worried about not controlling an outcome that they really care about. One may be the climate, it may be that they have asthma. The other may be that, we're at work in order to work. I have enough stress in my life. I do not want it in the workplace. We've seen in a lot of workplaces that this has been very destabilizing. Again, climate is a proxy for a lot of other issues. And then when people feel destabilized at work, neither of these parties are feeling heard. And, we heard a little bit earlier about Professor Dabour's research on the baby monitor. The employees are vocalizing, we're having a really hard time trying to figure out what they're saying. But like with his baby monitor, if we had a better sense of what they were saying, we might have a better response. The response in some environments have been to, sort of abandon, stop working, or resent an organization that has been claiming to be doing something for the environment. We talked about greenwashing, I think, in one of the presentations yesterday. So David is going to take us to the second half of our presentation, which is, once you see these emotions not as distractions to your dinner table, your group of friends, or your team meeting or your research team, but you really see them as data. And it's important to listen to both sides. One thing that often happens is that when people are too anxious, we tend to dismiss them. We say, well, they're just being anxious. When people display contempt, which is, well, it doesn't really matter, you guys are all crazy, we also tend to dismiss people who are contemptuous. But sometimes they're actually vocalizing something that is worth listening. In order to figure out what these signals are and how you support them effectively, requires the kind of tools that coaches and leadership trainers like David think about and educate us all on. So I will pass it on to him to share some of his thought and what he's observed with clients and working with teams around the world. David, thank you so much for joining our community today. It's special to have us with you.
Thank you, Carin, and I'm really delighted to be part of this international conference. I think I'm an executive coach. I've been an executive coach for about 5 years. Previous to that, I was in the corporate world. When my clients come to me, they generally come to me for two reasons. The first reason is that they want change. They want to change something about their career, their skill set, but they also come to me when they're confronted with change. And climate change obviously is a very big change. stressors are not new to the workplace, but this is likely going to be a permanent stress or stressor that we continue to see in the workplace and that people show up with. I think there are a couple of levels to think about this. One level is creative adaptation. And human beings as a species we've shown ourselves extremely good at creative adaptation. Secondly, it's about coping. How do we cope with climate change? How do we cope with the feelings that relate to climate change? So I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of the playbook for dealing with climate change from a creative adaptation point of view. And then the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about some coping strategies. So the starting point for any leader or individual is really reflecting on their own feelings. It's self-reflection, it's self-awareness. It's how are you or how are leaders feeling about climate change? So they're aware of what they're going through. The second aspect is understanding how others are experiencing climate change, because all of us will respond differently to climate change. As Carin said, some might respond, it's certainly fear-based, but some might respond with contempt, and others might respond by expressing concern or worry in a meeting, for example. So internal self-reflection, understanding that people around us are going to respond differently. And the next is, how do we shift from perceiving this as a disaster to responding and becoming an adaptation culture? And that's where creative adaptation comes into play, because we do want to feel empowered, we do want to feel motivated. How do we transition ourselves from fear to action, to what can we do as a result of this climate change, as a result of these feelings, and turn those perhaps negative feelings into feelings of empowerment and feelings about what we actually can find the courage to change. We want to avoid maladaptation, greenwashing, energy-intensive quick fixes. That really undermines trust. It's a little bit misleading, and frankly, people can see right through it, and there's a pretty good chance that it will conflict with values. We also want to consider building an emotional continuity plan, very much like we build an operational continuity plan. How are we going to be dealing with a feeling of loss, which you would expect climate change is going to increasingly fuel? How do we keep people going, empowered, motivated, trying to make a difference without getting too caught up in the things that they can't control? And ultimately, how can we become the ancestors' future employees and citizens who people will want to thank? Next slide. So coping strategies can fall into three buckets. The first bucket is problem focused and changing behavior. For example, leaders of organizations can engage in brainstorming about how to become more efficient as an organization or as a team, how people could volunteer in programs that will support energy savings activities. So that's the first, problem focused. The second is emotion focused. And this is about regulating responses. And all people respond differently to change and to stress. Some will find that meditation will be very helpful. Others will find that connecting to nature will be helpful. It really is about trying to let go of some of those negative feelings and think more about what can people actually do to deal with the change and adapt to the change. And the last bucket is more meaning focused. And this is, for example, it may be beneficial in certain companies to embed sustainability into the company's mission or vision. That perhaps will better unify people whose values are conflicted with the sort of activities that are not sustainable or polluting. So in certain organizations, it may make sense to actually embed into the mission or the vision the values that represent how people are coping with climate change. There are also some resources available. There's certainly a climate wheels that can be used, which help people get more in touch with how they're feeling, which can support their efforts to perhaps regulate those emotions and make that transition from feeling perhaps sad or angry or frustrated to empowered and motivated to make a difference. There's also the Yale program on climate communication, which does surveys and can provide insights into how people are feeling about climate change. And I guess lastly, I'll finish by through a quote, which is, it's really important, particularly in the case of climate change, to have the courage to accept what we can't control and let go, but also find the courage to control what we can. And as Carin explained, and I've tried to explain, there is an awful lot that we can control. And if we combine this creative adaptation with coping mechanisms or strategies, we can get through this change.
Thank you so much. And also the notion of, these skills that are being learned in this particular area can be transferred to others. We're focused on economic affairs here, and the cost of climate change is global. It's absolutely enormous. And if you overlay the emotional cost onto it and the impact on mental health, we felt that it was an issue that would be interesting to discuss with our community collectively. There's been a lot of focus on burnout and all these emotions that people are having a hard time regulating at work, just as the planet seems to be burning up. And so we've double clicked on the intersection of both of these big global trends.
And if I can add something Carin was saying, I do think that the younger generations are going to be particularly disturbed by what's going on externally and showing up with those issues in mind at work.
Questions, if there are any questions or conversations that maybe you have had, or local impacts that you're feeling. It's certainly very related to innovation. We cannot really innovate when we're feeling so stressed and emotionally dysregulated. When we're feeling dysregulated, we also is not a sustainable way of living. So a lot of the sustainability conversation has been related to the planet, but we're part of the planet and our own ability to sustain ourselves as productive, balanced members of society who do not lurch from one extreme to another because we are so under pressure, feels very, very fundamental at the moment. The resources that we've shared are US focused, but we are both European. I grew up in Africa, spent some time in Asia. There are many global resources also. The idea behind the climate wheel is it's something that you can use with individuals to sort of help them formulate. Because often with these difficult conversations, we have a very hard time just getting going. And so what we found was useful is to have, third-party resources where you can start having a conversation with your team. You can also start from data rather than opinions. So.
Yeah, I think something that we obviously want to avoid is we have a tendency to numb our feelings, and if we numb our feelings, we'll carry them around, and it could undermine collaboration. It can undermine our creativity and innovation. So the degree to which we can become more aware of those emotions, and I guess as leaders, it's very important that they create the space for people so that they can do that.
Mm-hmm. And to tackle all the issues that a lot of the research teams that we've been hearing about in the past day and a half are really focused on. So, any questions? Any reactions?
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Carin-Isabel and Dr. David, for your presentation in this topic or this presentation is very insightful. We open the floor for just 2 minutes, 1 or 2 questions if members.
We spoke extra fast in order to have time for questions. Yeah. So we would love to have and to learn from you. It's the point of these conferences. And if not now, please find us on LinkedIn. We've written a lot about also the intersection of feeling passionate about our work, but also finding it hard to have our passion at work, which is something that a lot of academics are struggling with at the moment. There's it's a challenge not just in the private sector, it's very much in all of the caring professions that are the teaching professions, the educator professions, healthcare, and management. We all find ourselves trying to provide answers to individuals who are having a hard time sometimes just formulating them. So.
Right. So this is a recommendation to the team. If you can go to Asia, jurisdiction, and then Africa, it will also help. I think it's only focused on developed countries like USA. So in your future research, if you can go to Asia and then Africa, to also help with those coming from that area.
Yes, we're very lucky to work with, and we have research offices in many geographies, so we're very, very connected. And there are many different points of views and situations, but we focus on the human responses because that feels really absolutely fundamentally global. And if you have resources or researchers who are in this space, please do connect them to us. We would welcome to learn from them.